sins. Furthermore, you attacked Paul and giving the impression to the Christians and Muslims that this view that you hold to is a view that stems from Islam. That's the impression you give. You do not inform the audience that in Sirah Rasulullah, the life of Muhammad, page 653, quoting Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq says that Paul was a legitimate messenger of the teaching of Christ and a traveling companion of Peter. So the early Muslims disagree with you, not with me.
Okay, did everybody catch that? He said that. Well, hang on one second. Let me replay. Let me get the. Hang on one second.
You give. You do not inform the audience. Matthew, in your words, is less developed than John. Matthew 1:21, it says, "You shall name him Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins." Furthermore, you attacked Paul and giving the impression to the Christians and Muslims that this view that you hold to is a view that stems from Islam. That's the impression you give. You do not inform the audience that in Sirah Rasulullah, the life of Muhammad, page 653, quoting Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq says that Paul was a legitimate messenger of the teaching of Christ and a traveling companion of Peter. So the early Muslims disagree with you, not with me.
Okay, so we hear that Shamoun, this clown, this shameless clown, Shamoun, says that Ibn Ishaq accepted Paul as a disciple and as a apostle of Jesus Christ. And Shamoun quotes Ibn Ishaq 653, Ibn Ishaq page 653. The problem is that the Shamoun has a reading comprehension problem. Like, he doesn't know what he's actually citing or quoting. He quotes from Ibn Ishaq, but like I said in my, discussion or debate with him, I schooled him on this topic, that if you read the beginning of that book, Ibn Ishaq, you read Ibn Ishaq page 36, there are scholars who say that Ibn Ishaq reported worthless sayings from people. So Ibn Ishaq was just writing down anything he heard from anybody. So if Ibn Ishaq was writing down anything he heard from Jews and Christians, and if some Christians told him Paul is a disciple, Ibn Ishaq just wrote that. He wasn't doing any fact checking. He was just writing down anything he heard from anybody. So Ibn Ishaq was just writing, stories from Jews and Christians without bothering to check whether those sayings line up with the Quran or the Hadith. Nowhere in the Quran is Paul mentioned. Nowhere in the Hadith is Paul mentioned. The authentic Hadith being Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, etc. So nowhere in the Quran and Hadith is Paul mentioned, and we take our teachings from the Quran and the Hadith. Well, Orthodox or Sunni Orthodox Muslims take their teachings from the Quran and Hadith. So if Paul is not mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, we can safely reject Paul as a disciple or as a apostle. Now notice what Shamoun is doing. He's just quoting Ibn Ishaq. He's saying, well, Ibn Ishaq this, Ibn Ishaq that, but he's not actually reading what he's quoting from, because if you read the beginning of that book, it says that there are scholars who say that Ibn Ishaq reported basically worthless sayings from people. You're just writing down anything you heard from anybody. So that's not binding on us Muslims. So you would have to prove that that saying goes back to the Prophet Muhammad or his companions, or the first three generations. You would have to prove that it goes back to Prophet Muhammad, the Quran, or the first three generation of Muslim scholars. So since Shamoun can't do that, and he's just quoting what Ibn Ishaq was copying from Christians, it's not binding on us. We don't have to accept Paul as a disciple. This is the problem with Shamoun and Christians like him. They don't know what they're quoting, or they don't understand what they're citing from Muslim sources. Like Ibn Ishaq, the history of Al-Tabari, etc., etc. So Shamoun does this a lot, David Wood does this a lot, etc., etc. So this is kind of the problem, is they don't know what they're reading. They don't understand what they're citing, and they don't understand that, Muslim scholars have developed ways to filter out good information from bad information, or reliable information that stems from the Quran, from unreliable narrations that stem from unknown sources, or Judeo-Christian sources. So that's what Ibn Ishaq was doing. He was copying anything he heard from anybody. So if Ibn Ishaq thought that Paul is a disciple, that's fine, but that's not binding on us. Well, we don't have to believe in that. We don't have to accept that. As we don't have to accept that as Quranic fact or anything, because Paul isn't mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith, so that's safe enough to reject Paul as a disciple. Ibn Ishaq also quotes from, or he says that John wrote the Gospel of John, but again, this is the same problem that Ibn Ishaq was just writing down anything he heard from anybody. Same issue with that claim too, that Ibn Ishaq was just writing down anything he heard from anybody. Thus, it's not binding or it's not authoritative according to Muslim scholars and standards. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead. So basically, Sam Shamoun is lying about Ibn Ishaq. He's lying about Paul being accepted in Muslim sources. Yes, Paul is mentioned in Ibn Ishaq, but that's not binding on us because Ibn Ishaq was writing down anything you heard from anybody. It's not. Ibn Ishaq is mostly not reliable, or it's not authoritative. We Muslims don't accept Ibn Ishaq's comments or whatever as binding or as authoritative to us Muslims. So we can safely reject this claim that Paul is considered an apostle according to Muslim sources. He's not, and Paul was never accepted. Or Paul is never mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith. That's the death blow to the claim that Paul is accepted in Islam, because if Paul is not mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, then that means he's unknown to the Quran and the Hadith. That means we Muslims take our teachings from the Quran and the Hadith. So if Paul is not mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, that means we can safely reject Paul as a false apostle, since he's never mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, and that's where Muslim teachings come from, the Quran and the authentic Hadith. So we can safely reject Paul, and we can safely mock and laugh at Shamoun's desperate attempt to try to prove that Paul is accepted in Islam. Absolutely hilarious, Shamoun. Absolutely hilarious. It's hilarious what these Christian followers of Shamoun will go to try to manipulate things or take things out of context to show that Shamoun wins debates, when in reality Sam Shamoun and his followers are constantly humiliated when it comes to topics pertaining to Islam, the Quran, and the Bible. Stay tuned, more videos going ahead.